From economics to communication, from one distinguished academician to another, I have the pleasure of introducing our colleague, Professor Dr. Joya Chakraborty, Professor and Head, Department of Mass Communication and Journalism, Tezpur University, Assam. A very distinguished colleague, and she has been supporting us through these series of workshops and earlier as well. So Professor Chakraborty has a bachelor's in physics and master's in mass communication from Assam University and a PhD from the University of Hyderabad. Her areas of interest are ICT for development, information and knowledge society, sociology of communication, technology and media, gender and ICT. Communication for social change, children and media participation, community media, and other areas are her specialization areas as well. She is a life member Indian Association for Women's Studies. She is a reviewer for international journals, a contributor for international journals, and she is a principal investigator for experience sharing documentation to reduce flood-related child death, capacity building for strengthening and integrating C4D approaches in development practice, and pedagogy and promotion of COVID-19 appropriate behaviors and vaccine, funded by Unicef from 2021. And she's also a project director for ICSSR major research project on historical continuity and cultural connotations of the mask traditions of Northeast India. Without wasting any time, I invite Professor Dr. Joya Chakraborty to address the students of IMC Dhenkanal, North Bengal University, Sidhu Kanu Birsa University, Purulia, and University of Gorbongo, Malda. Over to you, Professor Chakraborty.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey, and it's my pleasure to be here. And I hope that today I do not face any network problem like last time. So hoping for the best, and nice being in the presence of young communication scholars that I see here. My lecture today is on media, women, and children. And I would try and give you an outline of the different guidelines which are there in place with regard to reporting on women and children as part of the broad spectrum of development journalism, which is the focus of this workshop being organized by Press Club Kolkata and Unicef. So give me a moment while I share my screen. I hope my screen is visible to you.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. To outline the structure of my presentation, I would want to say that we would look at the perspective of media, women, and children from the context of rights and responsibilities. We understand that whenever we are talking about rights, it also comes with certain responsibilities. Entire discourse of the legitimacy of media as the fourth pillar of democracy comes from the rights which are enshrined in our constitution in terms of the freedom of speech, and that's why we call about media being the fourth pillar of democracy. But along with those rights, we also have the connect of responsibilities. That means when media is reporting on women and children, it also has certain responsibilities, not only just towards these two categories of citizen, but in general towards the entire democratic system, to all people whom the media is trying to report to and talk about and represent, and whose voices it is trying to represent. So we are looking at the connection between rights and responsibilities of the media when talking about women and children. And that's what we would want to look at while we are talking about media, women, and children. So I will take you through certain statistics which are there with regard to the available statistics with regard to the pattern of reporting, the pattern of participation. And then I would also take you through some of the rules and regulations and legislations and ethical standards and guidelines which are there. So that's going to be the main framework of my presentation today. But another thing with which I would want to start my discussion is that when we are talking about media, women, and children, we are again going to talk under two broad perspectives. As I say, rights and responsibilities is one, and another when we are looking at this connection between reporting on women and children, we will also look at another two perspectives, which is representation and participation. By representation, I was referring to something which I spoke recently, that we are talking about how women and children are reported about. That's representation. In what way they are covered by the different dimensions of media. And then connected to it comes participation. That means how they are participating. The essential connection between representation and participation being the assumption that with better participation, the representation can improve. So there are statistics which talk about discrepancies in terms of the representation of women and children. Hence, it is argued that with better participation, the representation can improve. So we'll go through some of these discussions. Starting with issues of women's representation in media. So we all understand that media plays a very important role in society. But if media plays such an important role in the society, how are women represented? Women, the 50% of the population. And why, again, it is important to talk about women, not necessarily just because women constitute 50% of the population. That's obviously very important. But another important dimension that we have to keep in mind while understanding the issues of representation of women in media is also the concept of marginalization. So when we are talking about development journalism in general, we are understanding that development journalism comprises the sensitivity towards social issues. It comprises the responsibility of representing the marginalized in the right manner, and also about giving voice to the voiceless, and also about the supporting the entire democratic process. And in this continuum, women's representation and also again how children are represented in media becomes very important, because they constitute, in most cases, marginalized sections of the society. We are well aware about the different ways of marginalization that women and children have been subjugated to. We understand about concepts of double marginalization, which comes from gender marginalization, as well as other aspects of social and economic marginalization. So hence, sensitive reporting of about issues of women and children gives a perspective to journalists, or when we are seeing sensible reporting or sensible representation of women and children in media, we can say that the overall standard or quality of journalism has improved, because these provide important benchmarks in terms of the representation of the marginalized sections and the presence of marginalized sections in the society. So that's one way of looking at it, apart from the fact that they constitute important sections of the population. Now, coming back to our discussion where we were talking about women's representation in media. So there are different global reports which say that the presence of women in news as subjects is very less. It is not commensurate to the population of women that we see. So if participation can improve representation, then what is the scenario? So we again see that when we are looking at participation of women and media, they constitute much less of the workforce of media professionals. And even in terms of the participation of women as media content creators, there is substantial difference across different formats of media. So we have more women in the electronic media, in television media, as compared to print and radio. Maybe there is a different reason, like a hidden sexism at work and stereotyping, even when we are looking at presence of women in the news format. This is something which we are drawing or understanding from the statistics. Maybe the reason lies somewhere else as well, but this is something which becomes evident from the way we look at statistics. Now, we also understand from this very connection that if representation has to improve, or we are to come beyond this idea of stereotyping of women's issues, and then what sort of stories are being written about women, what sort of decision-making power do women have, then we will also need to look at the glass ceiling, the concept of glass ceiling, where we understand that women, even if when they are part of a particular workforce, they usually do not rise to decision-making positions within a particular organization. And interestingly, to note that the media sphere, the workspace of a media newsroom, is also laden by the problem of a glass ceiling, where we see that very few women are in leadership positions. So we see this difference here in terms of the presence of women leaders in the newsrooms of India, which essentially means that when it comes to gatekeeping role, women are not mostly there in terms of the decision-making role. So if they are not in decision-making role, obviously they are probably not influencing the way that the content gets created, or they are not in a position to influence the representation of women's issues in media. Now, when we are looking at women's participation as content creators, so women journalists, as compared to their male counterparts, get less chances in content creation. And they are also mostly covering the soft stories. They are not into hardcore news reporting. So I wouldn't say this is for all journalists, but this is a statistical finding when it comes to an analysis of all news channels or all women who are part of the news force. we also have to understand that apart from the divisions that we are talking about, that in print, the representation is less, in electronic, the representation or participation of women is more, there are distinctions across media formats. We also need to understand here the economics of media when we are looking at the different regional media. So there are also differences when it comes to the regional media, because the economy, the revenue structure, the pay package, the working conditions are also very disparate when it comes to the regional media. So the national media and the regional media or the vernacular media, there are important distinctions in terms of the quality of workspace, the type of salaries, the type of role that women get as being part of the media industry, the media content creators. So women comprise about 25% of those who write news stories in English newspapers. And when they are writing news stories, they are not always also getting bylines. So that's in terms of the recognition of the work that women do. So we see differences when it comes to English newspapers, when it comes to Hindi newspapers. So these are statistics from English and Hindi, but obviously there are going to be different statistics when we look at other regional media or other language media in India. Different language structures have different ways of operation as far as the news industry is concerned, and the role that women play either as news anchors, presenters, as reporters, as editors, and the pages, when it comes to print, the pages that they are editing, the responsibilities that they have within the newsroom. So important distinctions that come out from the statistics when we are seeing about English television news, like women appear in 15.7% of all flagship debates and comprise 22.4% of the panelists on average. So there are distinctions when it comes to taking part as panelists and being there as anchors. Women appeared in just 8.3% of all flagship debates and comprised 9.3% of the panelists in terms of the Hindi television news. And only 3.2% of flagship debates are on gender issues. So, and women comprise 47.8% of the panelists participating in them. So when it's on gender issues, it's the women who are participating on those issues. But women-related issues are there only in 3.2% of the debates. In terms of content, in terms of different formats of news, we see important distinctions. Even in radio, we see women outnumber men as RJs. So that's again interesting, as I was mentioning earlier, that is there a sexist dimension to it? Is it so that there is a different reason as to why there is more representation of women when it comes to radio or to television compared to print? And what role do they play in those organizations? Does it lead us to think in any particular manner? So that's one way. And then, as I was saying, that are there, as journalists, as young journalists, as young reporters, as you are going to enter into the media scenario, then what sort of ethical guidelines are being presented to you for the coverage of different issues? So different international organizations have put in different guidelines in terms of ethical reporting on issues of women. Many of those specifically comprise of guidelines which talk about reporting on violence against women, because that shows women as vulnerable, as more susceptible to certain different forms of violence, and hence the guidelines are more specific in terms of violence against women, the different ethical guidelines which are presented. So the primary aspects of the guidelines provided by UNFPA are that content should ideally provide calls to action, including information about locally available support services. So rather than just representing the women as vulnerable, as victim, it should also provide guidelines about, or whatever report is being written, it should talk about call for action, and then what are the different support facilities which are available. It should inform other women about the possibilities of rescue, about the possibilities of support, and sensationalizing the different content of violence or giving a detailed description of the violence, which might trigger other people or other, what should I say, memories in certain other people, or it gives ideas to other people. So in terms of giving details of the violence, there should be reasonable restrictions. So while accuracy of reporting is one aspect of it, protecting the identity, protecting the well-being, protecting the psychological well-being of not only the victim, but other people who might have gone through a similar sort of a violence, and they might get triggered with that sort of news reporting, has to be maintained. So visual representation that portrays survivors as victims. So that the way that we present a particular subject, when we are talking about a woman who has gone through a violence, we are supposed to talk and represent women as empowered beings rather than as victims and vulnerable individuals. So that's about giving a guideline to other women that yes, it's possible to stand up against violence. So in many cases, when you see the reporting on women who have gone through various sexual or other violence, then the story is about the strength of the women, the ability of the women for having spoken up. That should be the language, that should be the treatment of the story. The perpetrator to be made visible. That means it's very important to not necessarily kind of, I wouldn't say identify, but then to make sure that the way that the perpetrator is presented in the news story kind of, again, perpetuates the same message that this sort of act is illegal and you are liable to be punished if you are doing that particular act. So rather than just talking about the women as a victim, it is also important to highlight the perpetrator in a way and the act of violence in a way that it is mentioned in the story that this sort of a particular act is illegal and you are liable to be punished, and hence the action that has been taken against the perpetrator. It's important to highlight that. Another important aspect here is that it's important to keep in mind the drivers of gender-based violence. This includes inequitable gender norms, attitudes, power imbalances, patriarchy, and harmful masculinities. That means we are also supposed to refer to the social realities around us while reporting on violence against women. So similarly, these are the guidelines which are provided by UNFPA. There are similar sort of guidelines which are also provided by the Press Council of India, the the body which is responsible for the ethical standards in terms of media's functioning in India. So there are some wide guidelines, broad guidelines, which are provided by the Press Council of India, that while reporting crime involving rape, abduction, or kidnap of women, female, or sexual assault on children, or raising doubts and questions touching the purity, personal character, and privacy of women, the names, photographs of the victims, or other particulars leading to their identity shall not be published. That means protecting the identity of the individual. In terms of the Nirbhaya case, we see how the identity of the victim was kind of created in such a different manner, and the entire reporting which happened around it, the type of advocacy that the media did for that violent act, and how the identity was protected. So that's a very landmark case in India. But beyond that, we also see that on different other occasions, how the protection of the identity of the vulnerable is important. And it's also there in different other ways, prevention of women against sexual offenses. So there are various other guidelines which also talk about protection of the identity of the women. So different women's organizations have also provided similar guidelines. I wouldn't go into the details. Now coming to the perspective of children and media. Here again, as I was saying, that this is another aspect, and why reporting on children is very less is, number one, they do not constitute a significant I would say a significant section of the population which is understood to be worth reporting about. Children's issues are reported by media, but then they are not prioritized like various other segments of the population. Most often, children's issues are kind of not at all highlighted, rarely on the first page. It comes in different other pages, and even when we are talking about the issues of children, it's usually the adults who are talking about it. So when we were during the period of lockdown, when education was kind of not happening, children were sitting at home, they were not able to play, we were seeing so many news reports which were talking about access to the digital facilities for different marginalized women, marginalized children who do not have access to education, do not have access to digital devices or online learning facilities. But rarely we heard a child talking about it. The narrative was there, the reporting was there, the statistics were also there on certain occasions, but rarely we saw a child talking about it. So children's representation of children's issues and participation of children. So both of these things are important considerations that we need to think about, that how much of space is allotted to children. They constitute a significant portion of our population again. But when it comes to issues of the children, both marginalized and other children, they do not constitute a significant portion of the news content. So the basic guideline which talks us about, or which tells us about issues of children, we have to look at it from the perspective of child rights. Child rights as enshrined within the broad perspective of human rights, which essentially talk about the right of the children. The major document which talks about the rights of the children is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the UNCRC. It's a document. It's a international document of which there are 97 countries which have signed on this particular document. They have agreed to that. Most of those countries, except the United States of America, they have ratified the UNCRC. India too is a signatory to that convention. It has multiple articles which talk about the different dimensions of the rights of the child. So that's the basic framework within which the rights of the child needs to be looked at. So it has certain general principles. General principles meaning the basic guidelines which are talking about the fundamentals of child rights worldwide. One being non-discrimination. Non-discrimination on the basis of caste, creed, religion, anything. So when we are talking about child and when we are talking about ensuring the rights of the child, it is a universal right which is available to all children below the age of 18 in all these countries without any discrimination. And all the activities that has to be done by caregivers and by the state and caregivers or adults or different institutions who are responsible for discharging or for upholding the rights of the child. All activities need to be done in the best interest of the child. So that's another fundamental principle in terms of child rights, that the interest of the child is paramount. And then again, right to life, survival, and development. That means every child has the right to life, to right to survival, and right to development. Another basic principle. And right to be heard. That's something that we rarely talk about. That means that the right of a child to talk, to voice his or her opinion on issues concerning the child, according to his or her level of maturity. So the child will talk about, and others need to listen to it, to be ready to listen to it. So these are the general principles. And again, the broad articles of the UNCRC again can be divided into three major three major compartments, which are the survival and the development rights, the protection rights, and the participation rights. So we understand the different aspects of survival and development, which talk about education, which talk about having a family, having parents, being able to play, having safety, security from harm, not to be subjected to work, right to education. All of that are subsumed in survival and development rights and protection rights. As media professionals, the aspect of right that probably concerns us most is the participation rights. That means children having an active voice. So the UNCRC specifically talks about this right of children to be able to talk about issues concerning them. So essentially, children who are understood that they do not have the capacity or they do not have the maturity to talk about issues, a right which is ensured to all adults, essentially in this particular case, is also ensured to all children. That means they also have the right to talk about issues that concern them. And we all understand that when we are talking about this right to give voice to one's concern, that is where media comes in. The right to communicate, right to participate in activities of one's own betterment, to talk about one's own participation and getting involved in issues concerning one's life. one's well-being. So the child also has that right, and media comes as the platform which is going to ensure this right to participation and right to have a voice. And that's where media becomes an important aspect of it. So these are the different articles which are there in the UNCRC. I wouldn't again go into that. Another act that we need to be aware about as young journalists is the JJ Act, or the Juvenile Justice Act. This essentially talks about children who are in conflict with law. This talks about the rights of the children who are in conflict with law. That means people who are involved in different sort of, or children who are involved in some sort of heinous offense. Now, here as well, we see the reflection of the UNCRC. Even though we are talking about a child who is in confrontation with law, yet we see the different rights which are ensured to this particular child. The Juvenile Justice Act talks about creation of a safe space away from all types of discrimination and inequality, and a space where proper justice is done to that particular child who is in confrontation with law, and then which are the special provisions which are available for a particular child. So, principle of presumption of innocence, principle of dignity and worth, so respecting the child, principle of participation, principle of best interest of the child. Again, even when the judicial process is in progress, the best interest of the child, that means creating a separate space for the judicial processes, the involvement of the family, the responsibility of the family. In most cases, as far as possible, the child should be associated with the family. The child should be allowed to stay with the family. So not stigmatizing the process of judgment, the way the entire courtroom scenario evolves, how the child is to be separated from other adult convicts, the entire courtroom, what sort of a space needs to be created, the separate spaces that need to be created for children. So there are specific guidelines which are provided in the JJ Act, which creates a safe space for appropriate justice, keeping the best interest of the child as paramount, even when the process of the judgment of or the trial of a particular case is going on for a child who is in confrontation with law, and protecting the identity of that particular child remains a responsibility of the press. And also, once we are aware about the provisions of the JJ Act, it should also become important for a journalist to ensure that the provisions of the JJ Act are realized whenever we are reporting about a trial procedure involving a child. So this gives us the perspective. That means sometimes it is not necessary for a reporter to just talk about the crime and say that the person accused is a child, this person is involved, and this is the case which is going on. But going beyond this, to look at the entire context within which the judgment is happening, whether the rights of the child are ensured in the process of that, in that particular judicial process. That is also a perspective that we need to keep in mind. And our awareness of the provision of the JJ Act provides us with this particular perspective, and hence we need to be aware about the provisions of the JJ Act. Now coming to again the ethical standards about reporting on children. A very important document in this perspective is the ethical guidelines for reporting on children. This is a document developed by Unicef, and it provides a broad framework about how children should be interviewed, how issues about children should be reported. So two aspects of this particular set of guidelines. Number one, aspects as to how children, we need to take the interview of the children, what sort of standards we need to maintain while interviewing children, and again, the type of standards that we need to maintain while reporting on children's issues. So there are 6 principles while interviewing children: taking the consent of the child, explaining to the child the reason for the report, taking consent of the adults and caregivers, protecting, like while taking the interview, ensuring that the child feels comfortable, secure, and safe, and not to be stigmatized. Because if we are talking about a child who has been at the receiving end of some violence or some crime, in that particular case, it's very important to understand the psychological state of the child, and not to make the child go through the same trauma over and over again through the process of interview. So keeping the best interest of the child in mind while interviewing, explaining to the child the context, and not to publish a story or an image that might put the child, their siblings or peer at risk. So we need to understand that their identity is not revealed in any manner which might put the child in a vulnerable situation. Do not harm any child, avoid questions, attitudes, or comments that are judgmental, insensitive to cultural values, that place a child in gender or expose a child to humiliation, or makes the child to relieve a particular pain or any traumatic recollection. There should not be any discrimination when we are choosing to report on a child or take interview of a child. So there are broad guidelines which are provided in terms of interviewing. Again, there are also guidelines which are provided in terms of reporting on children, in terms of obscuring the visual identity, and obviously taking consent and presenting facts in a particular manner becomes very important. But obviously there are reasonable, what should I say, exceptions to this, because when we are making a positive story about the achievement of a child, in that case, obviously the presentation of the image of the child or the identity of the child is in the best interest of that particular child. It is talking about the achievement of a child, and hence then obviously there is no problem, provided there is consent from the child and also the parents or caregivers of that particular child, that the name and identity can be presented, because it is for the healthy development of that child, and it's also going to encourage others. So there are those exceptions which are there in terms of protecting the identity of a child. Another important guideline that we need to be aware about is protection of children from sexual offenses, or the POCSO Act. One very important aspect of this particular act is that we need to be aware about the different. It's a gender neutral law. It does not talk about a boy child or a girl child. There is no time limit in terms of reporting, because many a times children do not understand the implication of a particular act, and it's only much later that they realize that they have been vulnerable to some sort of a sexual exploitation. You might have come across a recent report in newspaper where we heard about a story where a particular child reported to her mother about a particular sexual offense which had happened to her about 5 years earlier by a particular teacher, when the mother was explaining to the child about good touch and bad touch. And that's when the child realized that whatever she went through 5 years earlier was actually a sort of a sexual abuse. And then the perpetrator was nabbed after 5 years. So there is no time limit for reporting a particular abuse. And not reporting an abuse, even if you are aware about it, is an offense under the POCSO Act. The identity of the victim to remain confidential. There are certain changes also which have come to this particular act. So that's broadly the different aspects of legal aspects which are there in terms of reporting on women and children. Yeah, so that was a broad outline. And what I would want to emphasize at the end is that once we are able to report responsibly on issues of women and children, that gives us the perspective in terms of the fact that we not only become aware of these legal provisions, but we are also we are also able to understand that the balance that we need to have when talking about the different marginalized sections of the society, not only just women and children, but other social segments who are marginalized. It provides us with that perspective, and hence the importance of understanding reporting on women and children within the broad spectrum of development journalism. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you. If there are questions, I can take those.
Students, we just have around 5 minutes for questions, so please go ahead if you have any questions for Professor Chakraborty. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, you are audible.
So anyone has any question? No question? Thank you so much, Professor Chakraborty, for such a detailed exposition of reporting on women and children. I invite our President, Press Club Kolkata, Mr. Sneha.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. Before I say anything, I would like to personally thank Professor Joya Chakraborty for being with us. I should not say that for giving this lecture. My dear students, I deliberately discuss this because Madam has been working on this, working on with Unicef and on development journalism since her doctoral days when she was undertaking her doctoral studies in University of Hyderabad. She was working with UNICEF, and then when she joined in University of Tezpur, one of the finest universities and finest mass communication departments in the country, she always spearheaded. There also she worked with UNICEF and she continued. So when we request Professor Chakraborty, we request because that we all know, and she has proved that she has a passion, a commitment, and a competence and understanding of the subject. So, ma'am, yes, at this hour, we personally find it very satisfying to have journeyed with you. So this is very, very enriching that you have addressed our students. I'm personally grateful to you that, yes, you could continue, you could take part. All the students have been immensely benefited because, you see, when we join the profession, there is not much scope of training. And these are the acts like under Section 228A, which prohibits the publication of the victim of rape. This is not an ethical issue. This is a legal issue. If someone does it by mistake or by intention, he is booked under a particular IPC, Indian Penal Code. And the child rights and how to report on children, how to report on women, and what are the consents to be taken, permissions to be taken. These are the new areas which a budding scribe or a future teacher should be aware of. Ma'am, I'm extremely grateful to you that you were able to, participate or give your lectures and and you enriched us in all the sessions. And we are very happy and we are grateful to you, ma'am. Thank you very much. And we look forward to continue our journey together for a cause, which you began much earlier age. We began much later, but we'll continue together. Thank you.
I think we are part of the same journey, you and me. You have been part of it since the beginning. And thank you for giving me this opportunity, giving me this platform to talk to so many young people. I look forward to this association. Thank you, Dr. Pandey and Dr. Shur, and also to Sucharita for giving me this opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you
Welcome,
so much. Hope to see you at our future endeavors as well. Thank you again for all this.
Thank you.
Thank you.